Okay.
Right here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Joshua Chazen, and I am the Executive Symposium and Manuscripts Editor for the Journal of Business and Technology Law. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Journal Symposium, The State of Concussions, Protecting Athletes Through Advances in Law, Public Health, and Science, here at the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law. The symposium is being held with support from several organizations here at the law school today, including the Business Law Program, the Entertainment, Arts, and Sports Law Association, the Maryland Intellectual Property Student Association, the Business Law Society, and the newly founded Maryland Journals Association. Additionally, I would be remiss if I did not thank the law firm of Miles & Stockbridge, as this symposium is funded in part by the Miles & Stockbridge Fund for Excellence in Business Law. Funding from the Miles & Stockbridge Fund will go towards publishing issues from the symposium as well. The State of Concussion Symposium, which has been developed over the past 9 months, is a direct result of the hard work of many individuals, without whom this event would not be possible. First, Hillary Hansen, Associate Director of the Business Law Program, has been instrumental in handling so many logistical details surrounding the event and has constantly proven to be an invaluable resource. It is safe to say that without her, this event would not be possible. The idea for this symposium stemmed from my classmate, Chris Aboyan, who you will hear from later today. He proposed the concept of having an event to one of the journal's faculty advisors, Professor Michelle Harner, and she pitched the idea to the journal, so a big thank you goes out to both of them for that. Finally, I would like to thank all my journal colleagues, many of whom are in the room today, and really without whom also the symposium would just not be held. And in particular, I'd like to thank Kevin Kellogg, our Associate Symposium Editor, who you will also hear from later today, for devoting a tremendous amount of time and dedication to the event. Luckily, we were able to avoid the lingering winter here in Baltimore. It was a little chilly today. So a huge thank you to all our speakers for taking the time out of their busy schedules to make it up here to Baltimore. The symposium today will be comprised of 3 panels, as well as breakout sessions, which will aim to present the issue of concussions from all angles, new technologies that aim to better protect athletes and educate athletes, coaches, trainers, and parents, return to play and return to learn provisions, baseline assessment testing protocols, public policy concerns surrounding sports, medical diagnoses of concussions and how they vary based on age and gender, nationwide legislation that aims to protect student athletes, and legal issues ranging from tort law to employment law to public health law surrounding the concussion issue. The Journal of Business and Technology Law, as the name states, focuses on the intersection of business and technology, seeking to stay up to date on the ever-changing, novel, and complex legal issues found therein. I'm sure there are people who likely do not think of concussions necessarily as a business and/or technology law issue, and hopefully after today you will be able to leave here with a better understanding of why that is the case and the vast array of areas that the topic of concussion touches. The reality is that so many of our lives are shaped by sports, whether you casually watch football on Friday, Saturday, or Sunday in the fall, whether you grew up playing soccer or watch your kids display their talents on the lacrosse field, or just cannot look away when hockey players throw down their equipment and start throwing punches. Through popular culture, we idolize athletes to the point where, unfortunately, we start to ignore the safety risks of collision sports. And the recent stretch of stories surrounding athletes suffering concussions seems unending. But hopefully today we'll provide better clarity on the risks athletes face each time they take the field and help us focus on how various professions can work together to protect athletes from short-term and long-term injuries from traumatic brain injuries. This morning, we are honored to begin our symposium with a very special guest. She comes from a long legacy of educators and lawyers. In January, the National Jurist named her among the 10 most influential people in legal education. An accomplished legal scholar with expertise in constitutional and tort law, she was honored with the Great Teacher Award from the Society of American Law Teachers in 2011. When our next speaker is not teaching and acting in an administrative capacity, she makes great strides in allocating resources to build the law school's programs in business and intellectual property law. Please join me in welcoming a strong advocate for the Journal of Business and Technology Law, the Dean of the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law, Dean Phoebe Faden.
Good morning, everybody. I am just really thrilled to be here and to see so many of you here with us. And I want to thank particularly Josh for that warm introduction, but also for laying the framework. But most importantly, I want to thank Josh because I've heard from many people in this room as well as along the way how instrumental he was in pushing this forward. We owe a great debt of gratitude for the hard work that you've done, and I look forward to being part of at least some of the panel discussions today, but also hearing about the great work that comes about. And I want to welcome all of you to Carey Law School. I don't know that we've ever hosted a symposium quite like this, but it is characteristic of what we aim to do in the law school and what we aim to do on this campus. In fact, you might say it's part of our DNA at this point. But by that I mean the Carey Law School is deeply grounded in the present. It can be fearless about exploring new ideas, often unanticipated conflicts, and contradictions or challenges that we get presented in the real world. What could be more challenging, as Josh has already outlined, as this long-standing love of football, hockey, and other sports, than to hear the news about what the effects of repeated blows might be and how it can shorten the lives of so many of the athletes, both professional and otherwise, who come in contact. So I congratulate all of the students, and not just Josh, for taking the step of planning this wonderful symposium, and also for encouraging such engagement across this campus as well as across the country. So thank you very much. So as Josh has said, he is the Executive Symposium and Manuscripts Editor of the Journal of Business and Technology Law. I'd also like to thank Kevin Kellogg, the Associate Symposium Editor of the Journal, and as Josh mentioned, Chris Haboyan, the Sports Law Chair of the Students' Entertainment Arts and Sports Law Association. So I'd like to give them a round of applause. And as Josh also mentioned, there are other people, our faculty and staff, who've been very instrumental in making sure that this goes along smoothly. Professor Michelle Harner, who will be part of the panelists, and she's in the back right now, is a director of our business law program, and she's going to be the moderator of this panel on helmet design and technology. Hillary Hansen, as Josh also has said, has been instrumental. She's the associate director of the business law program, and without her, things could not possibly run as smoothly as they do. There have been other faculty members that I want to acknowledge. They'll be here today from time to time, and that some of them will be participating. Faculty members include Don Gifford, James Grimmelman, Kathleen Hoke, who also directs our Legal Resource Center for Public Health Policy, Marley Weiss, who's also going to moderate a session on legal issues surrounding concussions, and Carrie Lowry, a panelist and an alumna, who is senior staff attorney at the Public Health Law Network with Kathleen Hoke. And that's a program that's funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation here at the law school. Before I conclude and introduce Dr. Faden, I would really like to say that about 8 years ago, before I came to the law school here, which I'm a proud proponent, I was at Temple Law School, and we have a member of the panel today who was a student while I was there, Steve Packman. And it brought to mind the fact that as a torts professor, I now teach con law and other things, but as a torts professor, I actually wrote an exam that was on this very issue. It was as a result of reading the New York Times. You recall about that time, they were just starting to talk about how helmets could be of particular importance to high school students. I must have spent days and days and days trying to take all that I knew and didn't know into a question that I thought the students could answer. So I wish I could find that question and send it out to you, but it brings to mind old memories of being a law faculty member and not a dean at these days. So now it's my honor to introduce Dr. Alan Faden, who's going to provide the framework for today's discussion. A neurologist by training, Dr. Faden holds the David S. Brown Professorship in Trauma at the University School of Medicine. It's particularly important to really emphasize that the discussion today will be in part from many parts of this university, and that's a really significant, important aspect of what we're doing. Dr. Faden is also the director of the Center for Shock Trauma and Anesthesiology Research. That's the first research center in the nation dedicated exclusively to the study of trauma, its complications, and prevention. The center's interdisciplinary team of more than 75 faculty members, associates, and postdoctoral fellows has done work which is having a profound effect on the treatment of blows to the head. Specifically, they have discovered that head trauma triggers gene responses, including those related to destructive inflammation in the brain and spinal cord. The inflammation can develop over long periods of time and persist, perhaps forever. This means that instead of seeing concussions as injuries, they must be treated within hours of days, or days, as Dr. Faden says. And they're now beginning to regard them as longer-term conditions that may benefit from treatment months or even after the initial trauma. The expanded treatment window holds enormous promise for the victims of concussions, obviously. Dr. Faden's breakthrough work is the result of an excellent education. After earning a BA in physics with honors from the University of Pennsylvania, that other law school in Philadelphia, he did graduate studies in history and philosophy of science at Indiana University before heading for the University of Chicago School of Medicine. He has spent much of his career in medical education, first at the University of California, San Francisco, where he served as vice chairman of its neurology department, and later at Georgetown, where he was, among other things, dean of research and graduate education at the medical center. He was also a professor of neurology and pharmacology at that medical school. So it's my great pleasure and privilege to present Alan Faden. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Haddon, for that very kind and generous introduction. In fact, I think you gave the talk and summary better than I could. My thanks again to the organizers of this symposium. It was actually fun to work with them because this symposium is unusual in several regards. It's not only an update, a critical update on legal aspects that you hear about to some degree and return to play issues, but it will actually underscore certain topics that have virtually never been taken on in a major way in any symposium, medical or legal. And those include such things as the role of age and gender in the response to concussion, something very underappreciated. And also a discussion of helmet technology, which I think will be important to hear. So as a kickoff speaker, I felt that my role was twofold. One, to provide a sort of an introductory summary of the nature of concussion, but more importantly, I think, to raise some controversies. And I'm going to be very controversial. In fact, some would say quite heretical in some of my comments. It is intended to be that, and it's intended to stimulate discussion in the later panels that we'll see today. So while he's getting the slides organized here, let me just talk a little bit about what I'm going to say, and that is first to talk about the nature of traumatic brain injury with specific reference to mild traumatic brain injury. Secondly, to describe some of the mechanisms of injury that are underappreciated, to raise some new areas. I'm actually going to coin a new term today, which I hope will, in some avenues, replace the CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy label, and I'll be controversial there as well. So let me, for disclosure, I do want to say one thing because I will make some comments about helmet technology, and I want to know that I am the president and CEO of a startup company called Kinetic Shield, which has been organized actually to develop entirely new concepts and technology for helmet design. So I also am funded, as was mentioned, by NIH and the Air Force to do concussion-related research. So traumatic brain injury, I think all of you know what that is. And what's remarkable is that it's hard to get a handle on the numbers. This number that's bannered about 1.7 million comes from a highly cited CDC, Center for Disease Control, report. It is woefully wrong. In fact, when it lists the categories of causes, sports-related head injuries don't make the top 3 or 4. And a separate report indicated that there may be as many as 3.5 million head injuries related to sports activities in this country. So we're talking about a number that's not 1.7 million, probably more like 4+ million in the country, which makes it one of the most important neurological disorders and one of the most important medical disorders that we have. There are other things that are mentioned and underappreciated, and those relate to, as I mentioned, the underestimates of sports injuries and so forth. But also underappreciated is what happens in aging. So the fastest growing group of head injured patients is really not concussions in athletes, although there are many of those, but the fastest growing on a percent basis is due to falls in the elderly. And this number is going up by, I think, 40 or 50% in the last 5 or 7 years. 1 out of every 3 individuals age 65 or older will have a fall in the next year. 1 out of 2 who's had a prior fall. And many of those have head injuries. In fact, a large percentage that go to ERs, maybe 60%, have concussion or more serious brain injury. And head injury in the elderly, we may not hear much of that today, is a really bad disease. So it's been said that the brain falls off a cliff after age 40 with regard to trauma, and it's largely true. And yet we have very little epidemiological data in post-65-year-olds suffering head injuries. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So I just wanted to mention, just to frame this, because there are many non-physicians, non-medically sophisticated people in the audience, what happens with traumatic brain injury? So remember, the brain sits in a cavity, the skull, and it's surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, but it can move significantly. And what happens with a torsion to the head that's rapid, and particularly in the lateral direction, saying no rapidly, is there's movement of the brain on the skull, and it does 2 things. 1, it can directly injure the brain because of the bony ridges in the frontal area and the temporal areas of the brain, which are noted here as being particularly susceptible to head injury. But also the brain is a very heavy organ, and it has long fibers that connect with the rest of the body and the spinal cord, and these can be damaged by such torsion, and it creates a condition called diffuse axonal injury, which itself is hard to find, hard to see, except pathologically, or with more sophisticated imaging techniques, but is a very serious problem. And you can see that some of the areas affected, like the prefrontal cortex in the front of the brain, or the temporal tips, or the hippocampus, are areas that are related to judgment, to memory, to executive functioning, and so forth, and which results in the symptoms we see. Now, I owe this slide to Dr. Lovell's group, who is a well-known concussion expert at the University of Pittsburgh. He developed the IMPACT testing tool. And what this shows is that concussion can cause a large number of symptoms. Some are emotionally related, particularly depression and anxiety. A number of somatic symptoms. Headache is really important. Sensitivity to loud noise or to light is another one. Sleep disorder, really important. Turns out that sleep disorders are more common in mild head injury than severe head injury, something that is maybe a surprise. And of course, cognitive disturbances are very important. And some of these issues are what are called pleomorphic. They're very diverse and diffuse, and are rarely appreciated by treating physicians if they're not expert in this field. Now, I owe this slide to David Hovden's group, a very famous investigator at UCLA, using PET scanning, which is a tool that shows you essentially brain metabolism using a radioactive material, a ligand. And what this shows you is, over here, is that this is mild GCS. So this is a Glasgow Coma score. 15 is perfect. That's a normal score after a head injury. And this is the most severe category, Glasgow Coma score 5. I dare you to tell me there's a big difference between those two. The profound blue shows hypometabolism that's quite profound. So the idea that mild head injury is mild is a misnomer. And remember this picture because it really says it all. So almost all the data we have in terms of epidemiology of head injury and the sequelae of head injury comes from studies in young athletes. And that's a real problem because it's, in fact, the largest population are not those. And it's a different disease as you get older, as I'll show you. So if you look here, in contrast to the textbooks, which tend to say that everybody's better within 3 or 4 days, in fact, the majority of patients, even young athletes, have symptoms at a week, and about 10% at about a month. But what happens when you get a little bit older, and we're not talking a lot older, you'll hear Pat Dischinger talk today, who's an epidemiologist. This is from our own shock trauma center, a large cohort study, largely questionnaire-based, so that has some problems. But what it shows in this population, which is average age 35, not 60, 35, that 40% of patients with mild head injury have a full post-concussion syndrome at 3 months. 4 different symptom components. They're largely disabled, and we don't follow up those patients. It's a very serious problem. As you get older, I would predict that there'll be even more severe and long-standing consequences of injury. The other point to be made here is, although intuitively one might think that women are protected from head injury because estrogen and progesterone are said to be protective substances, in fact, in every study that's been looked at, young or older, women have worse symptoms and longer duration symptoms than males. And this is shown here in the study where females have more than a 50% sustained rate of symptoms at 3 months. So I want to say a little bit about what's really important, and so we're going to hear about return to play today. And the idea of a concussion, a mild head injury, is a blow to the head or to the body, it doesn't have to be the head, that creates a change in brain physiology. What does that mean? Well, we usually do it by symptoms. As a person have a headache, or they fuzzy-headed, dizzy, and so forth. But one can begin to study it. So traditional imaging, like a CAT scan, CT scan, or an MRI scan under normal conditions, rarely shows you an abnormality. If you get more sophisticated, this is from a study that was in the trauma literature, you can get much more sophisticated tools. So there's something called diffusion tensor imaging, which allows you to see the integrity of tracts in the brain, and magnetoencephalography, which is like an EEG but looks at magnetic signals and allows you to look at connectivity or changes in connectivity in the brain after injury. These are very sensitive tools, and very often when a person is absolutely normal by every test, neurology testing, sophisticated neuropsychological testing, balance testing, everything normal, these will show abnormalities. Now, it's even gotten more sophisticated than that. So the issue really comes down to, when do you get the return to play? Normally, we go through, even in the best of circles, a basic exam, balance testing, impact testing, a neurologic exam, maybe cognitive testing. That doesn't do it, because the brain is clearly susceptible to a second hit if there's an abnormal brain physiology. This is a study that appeared, shown here, from a group of athletes, football players, I think it was Division I football players, that were injured, had a concussion. They were absolutely impeccably normal in every single test, exquisite testing, neuropsychological testing, even default motor, functional fMRI, functional MRI testing, which is considered to be the most sensitive measure, one of the most sensitive measures going. And yet, they were all normal there, but if you put them on a stress test, which was 5 minutes of bicycle riding, the majority of those individuals became abnormal. So the question is that an abnormal brain physiology? I would say yes. And yet we don't even look for that. So we're clearly sending athletes back to play when they have abnormal brain physiology and will be susceptible to a second hit. Very important to recognize. All right, let's talk about something that's gotten a lot of attention, which is the idea of repeated concussions. And it's well known in the boxing literature, dementia pugilistica, boxer's brain, the punch-drunk fighter. You're all aware of that. And this was very, very heavily detailed in the 50s, including pathology of the brain. So the CTE work, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, it's been emphasized by the McKee and colleagues in Boston, is really an old story. It's a story that repeated concussive injuries, subconcussive injuries to the brain can cause severe damage in some people. And chronic traumatic encephalopathy, I'm going to be controversial here because I've taken on this group publicly in many places. It's a real disease, there's no question, just like it's a real disease in boxers. But I believe it's a very, very small subset of individuals with even repeated concussion. So that's a problem because it's been so overhyped and so overemphasized that they miss the forest for the trees. Let me tell you where the trees are. The trees are the fact that head injury, and including I'll show you later, repeated mild head injuries, can cause a chronic progressive disorder, as Dean Haddon had indicated. These are data showing on the left, these are clinical studies in humans with sophisticated fMRI studies, and what's colored there are differences between early exams and exams at 1 year. So what you're seeing is the progressive development of structural abnormalities that were not present initially. And this is work in animals, and we've done much of the same, to show a clear progression in the lesion over time. We've studied it in rodents up through a year. There's continued progressive increase in the lesion and progressive loss of brain cells, including in the areas responsible for memory and executive functioning. This is our own work, which demonstrates that, again, the progression, this is using high-field MRI scans, higher than are done in humans typically, in animals, and following the same animals over time to show a clear progression over the first 3 months, and again from 6 months to 12 months, and there's a progressive dropout of cells in the hippocampus of the brain, which is a critical part for memory. Now, you could say, well, okay, that's fine, that's an animal stuff. What about in humans? Well, this is a very important study that was just published about 1.5 years ago in the Best Neurology Journal, in which a group of investigators from England and Germany looked at individuals with head injury years after the head injury, up to 15 years, I believe, at the longest, and used a new technique, which is, again, PET scanning with a translocator ligand, which marks inflammation in the brain in the living person non-invasively. And what they demonstrated is a large number of patients had florid inflammation in the brain, not where the injury occurred, but in the deep structures, the diencephalon here, which are really critically important for integration of functions and memory to some degree. And in fact, the extent of the inflammation long-term correlated very well with the specific loss of cognitive function in those pathways. So this was one tool. And then quite soon after that, this paper appeared, which is really important. This is from the Glasgow group, which first reported in the 50s that they could see evidence of chronic inflammation in brain-injured patients that died 30, 40 years later. And what they showed is, and reported here, is that more than, I think they said 28% of patients who died with a moderate or severe head injury had inflammation. But the study was underestimated dramatically because they actually didn't sample the sites that show the major inflammation. So I would say that these numbers probably are going to be well in excess of 50% or more of patients with head injury. Now this is moderate or severe, not mild. So where the rubber hits the road is, what about repeated mild head injury? Not been studied. Not been studied. Needs to be studied. So we did these studies in animals. These are rodent studies in which we did 1, 2, or 3 concussive head injuries in animals and looked to see outcomes. And I'm not going to bore you with the slides except to say that what it shows is that there's a tremendous amount of inflammation that occurs. Doesn't occur after a single head injury, but as you increase the number of head injuries close in time, it gets amplified. So concussion sensitizes the brain to inflammation. The second concussion amplifies that inflammation dramatically. And what's interesting in all regards is that when you get to 3 concussions, it absolutely simulates in every regard moderately severe head injury. Over time, the inflammation lasts as long as we've studied it. It's associated with progressive loss of cells to the same levels of moderately severe injury. A hole in the brain basically over time occurs. And the animals become cognitively impaired progressively and motor impaired progressively, okay? So these are the first data I'm aware of showing that repeated concussion. Others have shown that repeated concussion causes inflammation. But these, I think, are the first to correlate them with long-term behavioral effects and to compare them with a more severe head injury. Now, what about therapy? And I think this is really important because this is not a lost cause. This idea that, okay, a person has 3 concussions, 5 concussions, they're doomed. They're not doomed. We can actually stop this inflammation in animals and stop it cold. And it turns out, interestingly, that I'm not going to go into the mechanisms, but we studied them at the molecular level. The mechanisms that cause the continued inflammation, okay, can be targeted, and we've targeted them in many ways. One way to do it is we've given this drug, which is not ready for prime time, but we're working on other ones that are, which interrupts a specific receptor in the inflammatory cells. And in these studies, we actually treated animals a month after, these are rodents, a moderately severe head injury. We took the animals and looked at the level of lesion with an MRI scan. We looked at the level of cognitive dysfunction, motor dysfunction, and all the animals were matched equally. And then we treated single injection in the brain and followed them for months longer. And it turned out that the animals who were treated recovered actually very close to normal in cognitive function over time. The lesion didn't get smaller, but it didn't progress. And then at the end, because I didn't think anybody would believe these studies, we sent the material to Johns Hopkins at the end of the study where they did diffusion tensor imaging at 9.4 Tesla. There is no human magnet at that level. And we have these fiber tracts in the brain. And what this shows you, here's a naive animal. This is an animal that's treated with no drug. It's just a vehicle at 1 month. And you can see the loss, what the difference between here and here is the loss of white matter tracts in the front of the brain. And you can see that a month later, if you treat, you preserve a large part of the brain. And this is very important to recognize that there is potential therapy for this repeated concussion. And lastly, I want to talk about, in this part, and then I'll just make a few comments about helmets. There's another way to do this, and it's very interesting, and that is something that may be a little counterintuitive, that exercise itself can shut down the same pathway, but it's absolutely critical when and how you do the exercise. So if this is a study which was published about a year ago, in which we used either early exercise initiation in rodent head injury, which started 1 week after injury. That's not a short time in a rodent. And versus starting 5 weeks after injury, where the animals ran a running wheel for a month. And what you can see here is the early exercise didn't do anything. If anything, it made inflammation worse. But late exercise markedly reduced the lesion, markedly reduced inflammation, and markedly preserved, these are hippocampal neurons, the ones that you really need to remember things, markedly preserve them. And this again, 5 weeks after head injury is when we started the process. And we're going to be beginning to do this with repeated concussion animals. And this simply shows that, maybe not surprising, that early exercise actually worsens inflammation. So you've got to be very careful. And my colleagues in spinal cord rehabilitation have learned this a long time ago. You may not do this. And people in stroke, Kevin's here, realize that early aggressive treatment, not passive range of motion, but aggressive therapy can make people worse. And studies have been done even in primates to show that that's true. So I want to basically coin the term here, and I've tried this out even with the other CTE group, that we really should be talking about brain injury as a chronic traumatic encephalitis, not encephalopathy. Encephalitis referring to inflammation of the brain. And the points to be made here is it's very common. It seems to be able to occur with repeated concussion. And importantly, it is potentially treatable. And I want to leave you with that positive note. And finally, I want to talk about helmets just to really stir controversy more. This is a picture of helmets starting on the left with the circa 1910 leather helmets up to the more modern helmets that occurred here. And there's been a lot of statements made by helmet manufacturers over the years, which is a self-policed group, that they're building bigger and better helmets for protection against concussion. And the question is it true? Because there's really no support provided in most cases for that statement. And a paper came out which really raised controversy about a year and a half ago, 2012, late 2012, maybe it's 2 years ago now, from a group at Case Western Reserve, which looked at several circa 1910 leather helmets against a wide array of the most modern, said to be most effective helmets in football, and found no material difference in most cases on most measures. They did an exhaustive number of measures. In some cases, actually leather helmets were better. And they didn't say go to a leather helmet. They simply said helmets today, despite what's said, are not terribly protective. And there's a good reason for that. There are two things that make brain injury worse after a hit, okay? One is the transfer of kinetic energy. You take an object and stop it suddenly, that kinetic energy goes right through the skull into the brain. And the other thing the brain hates is stretching. So rapid acceleration, deacceleration causes major injuries. Most studies have studied just linear acceleration problems, not rotational. And any way to really solve you're not going to solve the problem of concussions, but any way to ameliorate it more than what's happening, we need much better ways of reducing kinetic energy and much better ways of preventing the axial acceleration. And there are technologies out there that can do it. They've never been implemented in any major way to date, and we can talk about this later if you like. And I do want to say by here that this has been controversial because Duma's group came back and said, well, that's really hogwash. We've studied it, and we find that the modern helmets are a lot better. But in fact, they didn't do studies in exactly the same way. They didn't study multiple kinds of helmets, leather helmets, and so on. But there is controversy here. And then in a study that hasn't been published yet, but will be presented at the upcoming neurology meetings, a group here, Dr. Canidi, I don't know whether Kevin knows him or not, but a Florida neurologist who is the vice chair of the American Academy of Neurology Sports Neurology section, interested in this problem, says, quote, in regard to the helmets tested, a wide number of helmets, all of them were terrible, including some that are said to be good here. And I'm going to leave you with that only because it needs to be studied more. And we're going to hear later today from Greg Merrill about the use of sensors, which I think is an important advance in helping us understand the connections between the changes in pressure and hit and so forth and force and ultimate outcomes. But I'm going to leave you in a way with this slide. We need much better ways of testing than this, okay? And we have them. I mean, there are now mathematical models called finite element analysis for doing studies. There are dummies that are fully instrumented that are looking at both linear and rotational forces and so forth. We're starting to get there, not by the helmet manufacturers, but by others in the field. And I think over the next 3 or 4 years, we'll have a much better sense of the nature of concussive hits and whether or not helmets are protective. And finally, this is a brain into a question mark because there are many more questions than answers in this field. We need people in the field doing research, clinical and basic, to begin to address this problem. What's the nature of repeated concussions? How important are subconcussive insults to outcome? And can we treat it? Thank you very much.